their environment. It's divided into populations and communities, energy and nutrient transfer, and cycles in nature. First, populations and communities. The whole Earth is an ecosystem on a global scale called a biosphere. Within the biosphere are many different ecosystems. While watching the next clip, make a note of the different ecosystems you recognise.
Our planet, the Earth, is, as far as we know, unique in the universe. It contains life. Even in its most barren stretches, there are animals. Around the equator, where those two essentials for life, sunshine and moisture, are most abundant, great forests grow, and here plants and animals proliferate in such numbers that we still have not even named all the different species. Here, animals and plants, insects and birds, mammals and man live together in intimate and complex communities, each dependent on one another. 2/3 of the surface of this unique planet are covered by water, and it was here indeed that life began. From the oceans it has spread even to the summits of the highest mountains, as animals and plants have responded to the changing face of the Earth.
The ecosystems you should have spotted are desert, tropical forest, sea, and mountain. In an ecosystem, there's a balance between an environment and the populations and communities of plants and animals living there. The different plant and animal populations are adapted to their environment. This balance is maintained because all the living things are linked through food chains. Sometimes, however, these food chains can be interrupted. In the next clip, we look at a lake in Devon to see why the fish populations, particularly the pike, are decreasing. Work out the food chain in the lake, ending with the pike, and decide why the fish populations are decreasing, as a result of heavy predation, pollution, or other factors.
Slapton Sands, South Devon. A 2-mile-long shingle ridge thrown up over thousands of years by the action of the sea. Behind the ridge is Slapton Lee Nature Reserve, an area of quiet beauty with many rare plants and animals. The main feature is a large freshwater lake, but the reserve also contains a wide variety of different places to live, different habitats, ranging from the open water to reeds, marshes and dense woodland. There are a surprising number of conflicts in the nature reserve. For instance, the fishermen themselves are far from happy. The fishing is definitely not what it was. The changes could be quite natural, or they could be the result of pollution. There's no easy answer. What is clear is that the balance of nature in the underwater world of the Lee is very complicated indeed. If the fishermen are right, the balance in this underwater world has changed significantly in the last few years. The main fish in the Lee are perch, rudd and roach, as well as the pike. The questions are how and why their numbers are changing. And in particular, from the fisherman's point of view, why are big pike now so rare? Some of the answers are slowly being discovered through a detailed study of the balance of nature in the Lee, a study of all its plants and animals, its ecology. Even apparently clear water is teeming with life. These are collections of microscopically small plants. They float around in the water, taking in sunlight and making food. The tiny plants are the source of food for tiny animals, plant-eaters, herbivores. These ferocious-looking insects eat other insects. They're flesh-eaters, carnivores. But they themselves might be eaten by even bigger carnivores, like the perch, and the chain doesn't stop here. The perch are the prey of the much larger pike, the top predator in the lake, the king of this particular jungle. Several theories have been put forward to explain why the pike are smaller than they used to be. For instance, pike feed on perch, rudd and roach, but these fish have become much smaller. It's been suggested that the pike find the small fish a very poor source of food. Each one isn't much of a meal for a hungry pike. Another theory is that there are simply too many pike. They compete with each other for food and space.
You should have worked out that the pike feed on smaller fish, perch, rudd and roach, that themselves feed on insects, who feed on microscopic plants. What happens to the pike if the perch, rudd and roach have less food? If the perch, rudd and roach have less food, they won't grow so big and their population will shrink. As their population shrinks, there will be less food for the pike, which means they will get fewer and smaller as well. When there's a shortage of prey, the predator numbers go down as well. Besides shortage of food, the pike also face competition from other pike for the same amount of food, space, and the opportunity to reproduce. Now for a sample question. Think about a habitat close to where you live. How is that habitat changing and why? Should we be trying to intervene to prevent change? The examiners expect you to be able to apply the principles of conservation to different habitats. So stop the tape and have a go. Some factors you should have noticed about your local habitat are the size of different populations and the relationship between them, like how they feed on each other. You should note the impact of any natural environmental changes and the impact of any human activity. That's the end of the section about populations and communities. This section is about energy and nutrient transfer. A food chain describes the feeding relationship between living things. It shows what eats what. In a food chain, one group of organisms in the chain provides food for the next. A food chain always starts with a green plant, a food producer, and contains at least 3 links. The food chain in the lake at Slapton Leas starts with plants, called producers, because they produce food in the first place by photosynthesis. The plant producers are eaten by primary consumers in the chain, tiny herbivores that eat only plants. These herbivores are eaten by the secondary consumers in the chain, flesh-eating carnivorous insects. They in turn are eaten by tertiary consumers, the perch, rudd and roach. Finally, these fish are eaten by a predator, another fish, the pike. Animals all get their energy by eating food, so the flow of energy in a food chain is from the food to the feeder, in the direction of the arrows. All food chains must start with plants, because only plants create their own food by photosynthesis. Without green plants, no animal life can exist. In an ecosystem, food chains do not usually exist in isolation, but are linked together to form a food web of plants and animals that are interdependent. This diagram shows a food web for a seashore community. Here, limpets and sea urchins both eat algae, and the herring gull eats both crabs and sea urchins. Remember, the arrows show the flow of energy around the food chain, which goes from the food to the feeder, from producer to consumer to predator. But that flow of food and energy can't go on forever. The next clip explains why not, and what happens to the energy in a food web.
Deep in the cells of all plants, there's a tiny reaction going on, and basically it's this. Sunlight, filtering through the green pigment, chlorophyll, focuses on a gas, carbon dioxide, and a liquid, water. It shuffles their atoms, making a solid, carbohydrate. And that's fuel. That's stored sunshine. Plants make fuel, but animals can't. So their only choice is to take the plant's fuel by eating them. Animals can eat other animals and get their fuel that way. So the stored sunshine passes from creature to creature. It's a food chain, a fuel chain. And at some point, the chain stops. That's because eating is a pretty sloppy way of transferring fuel. Each animal in the chain only passes on 10% of its energy. The rest is simply burnt off as heat. It doesn't take long to get to the point where the fuel runs out, with an animal that's not worth eating. Here the sunshine stops with the otter. And that's why otters and other big predators are rare.
One way of looking at the amount of energy passed along a food chain is with a pyramid of numbers. That's the number of each animal or plant that the food chain can sustain. For example, it takes 2,000 grass plants to feed 25 voles, which support just one owl. But the pyramid of numbers can be confusing. In this food chain, one large oak tree supports thousands of caterpillars, many blue tits and one sparrowhawk, so it's not actually a pyramid at all. If we change it to a pyramid of biomass, that's the actual mass of biological material at each stage, then one oak tree represents a huge amount of biomass. The caterpillars less, the blue tits less still, and the sparrowhawk even less. So now it's a pyramid. The biomass pyramid also gives a clearer picture of how inefficient a food chain is. In the same way that energy is lost at each stage of the food chain, so the total biomass reduces as you go up the pyramid. Here's a common exam question. Explain what happens to the energy at each stage of a food chain, and why eventually there isn't enough to pass on to a larger animal. Stop the tape and have a go at this question. Remember, the question is asking what happens to the energy, not the food. A fairly full answer would go something like this. To start with, plants make food material by photosynthesis using energy from the sun. When plants or animals are eaten, only some of the food energy is permanently absorbed into the body of the eater. The transfer of energy at each step in a food chain is as little as 10%. The rest of the energy is lost to the surroundings as heat through respiration, excretion and digestion. The food chain rarely has more than 5 or 6 links, because by then there isn't enough energy left to pass on to any larger animal. What if the exam asks you about food webs and habitats you haven't come across before? Well, don't panic. There's always enough information in the question for you to apply what you know about another food web and to answer the question. That's the end of the section on energy and nutrient transfer. This section is about cycles in nature. One important cycle in nature is the carbon cycle. Carbon exists on Earth in many forms: in carbon dioxide gas in the air, as carbon molecules in organic materials such as plants and animals, and in fossil fuels like coal, gas and oil. All these forms of carbon are continually recycling from one to another, but the total amount of carbon remains constant. This is how it works.
The level of carbon dioxide in the air depends on many different processes. Photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide as a raw material to produce sugars, so plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Both animals and plants get their energy by respiration, a chemical reaction which releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, but this is a two-way process. When the sea gets warmer, some of the carbon dioxide comes out of solution and passes back into the atmosphere. Natural processes like these balance out, so that the tiny percentage of carbon dioxide in the air is maintained. But human activity is now increasing carbon dioxide levels.
So the carbon cycle of respiration and photosynthesis among animals and plants maintains a constant level of carbon dioxide in the air. This keeps the Earth's atmosphere in a constant state suitable for human, plant and animal life. There's more about cycles in nature in the higher tier science programme. That's the end of the section on living things in their environment.